I know you've had some good panels already this morning, and we'd like to try to keep the momentum going with a session now entitled A Matter of Will. Can we sustain our commitment to excellence for all children? Folks, if you got conversations, can we take them outside or sit down? Those are pretty much the two choices. Option A or option B. All right, well, I'm going to start introducing our panelists for our next session. The President of the Education Trust, Kati Haycock. The Superintendent of Schools for Prince George's County, John Deasy. The President of the American Federation of Teachers, Randi Weingarten. And the Superintendent for Atlanta Public Schools, Beverly Hall. Now, in addition to our panelists, we also will have in the audience with you two what we're calling moderators to the people, or maybe the better, easier way to understand them would be sideline, the equivalent of sideline reporters in a football game. We're going to have two folks, Jason Camras, who is the former National Teacher of the Year here in the DC Public Schools. Jason, are you? There he is on the side. And Diane Pichet from the Leadership Commission on Civil Rights. Diane, are you here? There she is. And what they will be doing is they will be circulating while we are working through the panel, getting audience feedback, questions, and thoughts. And at two junctures in the panel, about halfway through and then toward the end, I will be turning to first Jason and then Diane to kind of raise some of the concerns and questions from the audience with the panel and get your responses to folks out there. And with that, I will make my own segue here from the podium to the panel. And we're going to start by asking all our panelists to address a big question, which is that obviously 6 years ago we made a major change in direction in federal education policy with No Child Left Behind. And here we are in a political season, in a legislative season. And I guess the way to start is to ask each of you, maybe Kati will start with you, what are the most important things we have learned in the years we have had experience with this law?
The most important thing we've learned is that when we really focus on something, we make progress. And the fact of the matter is that especially in the last few years, we focused a lot more on achievement in elementary and especially in middle schools. We focus in particular on the achievement of the kids who are furthest behind. And the fact of the matter is we're making progress. So what we're learning is when we really focus, we can actually do this.
So a couple of things that we've learned. One is that the fundamental premise and action of the law was to make the invisible visible. And that not only a moral obligation, but it is also part of the civil rights agenda, and it's part of the fundamental fabric. If we actually do believe in all youth, we have to do that. Another thing that became evident very early on was that information is a very powerful commodity. And I argue that the currency of privilege is information. And if we actually want youth and families of privilege and youth and families of poverty to excel at the same rate, everyone needs the same information about what's going on in schools, what high-quality teaching is, especially issues of access. And the third thing is that teaching matters. Teaching matters a great deal.
Well, perfect lead-in. Randi?
I think what we learned, I'm not going to repeat, but I do agree with both, with what was both said. What we've learned is that focus matters, transparency matters, accountability matters, responsibility probably matters more than accountability, and the question becomes now what to do with all of this. The issue, I think, is no longer whether this matters. I think the call for urgency you saw this morning, you've seen all throughout, at least those of us who believe in education of kids, and as John Podesta said, believe in opportunity for all kids. But really, the new terrain is how do we do this? And I think that's what the next challenge is. And I think we will get people focused on the crisis and the urgency if we start coming up with a shared definition of how to do this.
Well, I won't repeat what has been said here, but I will say this, that I believe that we had heard all through the 70s when I began my career in a great deal in the 80s that all children can learn. I think with the setting of high standards, the accountability that came with it, the fact that so many urban systems embraced both of those and began to show the kind of growth that some of us are showing, we now are really saying it's not just rhetoric, but if you raise the bar and if you provide the kinds of supports we need for our teachers to learn to teach to high standards, and you measure and hold people accountable, indeed, children, regardless of their socioeconomic background, race, ethnicity, etc., can reach high standards.
Well, let me start with you, and then I'll try to narrow this in a little more tightly. When you look in your own experience at schools that are succeeding in this new environment and schools that are not, schools that are less successful and the schools that are more successful, what are the most significant differences you see between the ones that are doing well and the ones that are not in this climate? Beverly?
Well, I'll start. I mean, the first thing I look at is leadership. When I went to Atlanta 9 years ago, it was clear to me that we needed to change the leadership in many of our schools, and 89% of the principals are now new. You can't do anything else. I don't care what you mandate or what standards you want people to meet. If you don't have the leadership in place to begin to work with the staff to make this happen, it's not going to happen. We haven't heard a lot about that today. But we did look at the leadership issue, and then we looked at the teacher quality issue. Again, who are teaching in those schools that are not performing, and what needs to happen if they do not respond to the professional development and supports. You also have to, I think, at the end of the day, be very clear that you will not, for lack of a better word, preside over failure, constant failure. And so the lowest performing high schools, for example, in Atlanta no longer exist. The lowest performing middle schools no longer exist. Because after you've changed the principal and you've provided support, if indeed they're not making the same growth progress as the other schools that match the demographic profile of the students there, then you have to look to what else is going on within the school system, within the school itself, and begin to make some more.
When you say no longer exists, closed?
Well,
doors shut?
One was closed completely. One we transformed into an alternative school, serving a dropout recovery focus, having a dropout recovery focus. And the third one we broke into 4 small schools. We kept the grades 10, 11, and 12 in one academy, and then we grew the others, beginning with the 9th grade. And that school went from a graduation rate of 23% when it was transformed to 66% before the first cohort of the new students graduate. When they graduate next year, we think that graduation rate will be 80%.
John, the dividing line between the schools that are succeeding and those that are not?
An absolute laser-sharp focus on the improvement of teaching and learning and the conditions of teaching and learning that exist in high-performing schools, and helping schools that are not high-performing. That is the first place we go to. Second issue is students and parents absolutely understanding what rigorous, high-quality work looks like and how one is able to produce that kind of work, so that there's no mystery about what is a high standard. And a third issue, which I also think is very, very important, is that schools that are high performing absolutely can be tested by surveying teachers and surveying students. Not only do we believe all children can learn, but are you getting access to high-end rigorous coursework? And are you getting access to the most experienced, most accomplished teaching? And that is a fundamental hallmark of high-performing schools.
Can I follow up on something you said? When you said not only students, but also parents have to know what high-quality work and expectations are. How do you engage parents at that level of detail? And what is the mechanism and what is the goal?
So I think one of the things that No Child Left Behind did was provoke a very strong opportunity and demand for schools to engage their parents, not in just information, but what the quality of schoolwork looks like. So at parent-teacher conferences, at PTA events, at principal coffees, this is what good science looks like in the 7th grade. So that the same professional development faculty members experience, parents need to know. So there's no mystery about what the rules of the road are when you go to get your license to drive. There should be no mystery about what the rules for graduation are and what high quality work looks like. And we were at a time, I think, before that where some knew and some did not know, and that was just fundamentally wrong.
Katie, and then Randy.
John makes a very important point. One of the things that we have noticed when we spend time in unusually successful, high-poverty, high minority schools is that the nature of parent involvement looks quite different from it looks in many places. It is very, very tightly focused on the academic expectations of kids with lots of examples of the kind of writing your children should be able to do, the kinds of math problems, lots of resources. And what's interesting about that is when you head in that direction in very poor communities, a lot of outsiders say, why would you do that, right? The parents themselves don't speak English, they're not very well educated. How could they possibly make sense of these academic standards and performance objectives? What's fascinating is how much they get it, how quickly parents get it, and interestingly, how no matter the poverty of the community, how easily able then parents are to mobilize resources and supports for their kids when they actually have a much clearer idea. But the same is really important for teachers. You know, one of the things that is easy to happen in audiences like this one, we talk about things like will, and the assumption is that that's mostly about a robust accountability system. If we just continue to push hard, that's what creates will. Well, I'm not going to argue against robust accountability. I think everybody in this room knows where we're at on that. But when we spend time with rank and file teachers in school buildings around this country, what we realize is the biggest thing that's interfering with their will is they don't have the clarity about curriculum and lessons and units and assignments that their counterparts have in other country. We ask them to take these vague statements called standards and somehow turn them into lessons and units. We throw into their hands textbooks, which are way too long for anybody to teach, even the most fabulous teacher, and we expect them to build will just because we're beating them hard around accountability. And one of the things that I think the Brits got right, and Michael Barber, I hope we'll talk a little bit about that today. They talk about high challenge, but also high support. And I think we didn't get the support part right. We need to be better at that.
Before Randi jumps in here, and we're teeing up perfectly with teacher talk at the end of each previous comment, but what does that imply when you're saying that there's a disconnect between the standards and what teachers are actually teaching day to day? How do you close that gap? What would be a practical means of either national, state, or local policy that would take you in that direction?
Well, I think we would argue that states, in leaving that curriculum function to local school districts, is essentially abdicated on a very important responsibility. We've said essentially, well, that's a local matter. States set standards, locals create curriculum, but the fact of the matter is, the typical school district in this country has about a half an FTE in the curriculum office, and that person also drives a school bus. I mean, give me a break. The idea that that people like that can produce the kind of quality lessons and assignments that teachers, especially brand new teachers, need is just not. So what do I think could happen? I mean, the federal government ought to put some money out there for consortia of states and school districts and universities to work together so we have maybe 4 or 5 really high quality curricula, something like core knowledge with lots of depth, intellectually rigorous stuff for both teachers and kids, so that teachers have some choices here instead of having to make it up for themselves.
Or let Randi come in.
You know,
John.
it's great that Katie said that. If there were teachers in this audience, they would be saying hallelujah to what Katie just said, because oftentimes, and I actually got one of these emails this morning, 6:04, I'm still writing my curricula for today. I'm still writing my lesson plan for today. I have to rush over. Maybe it's the person who was writing the curriculum. I have to rush over to the school to make sure that I get a parking spot so that I can be here in time for class. It's the cohesion between standards, curricula, good teaching, the connect with students.
Well, do you agree with Katie? I mean, where would you like to see that gap filled? Who would you like to see?
Well, I think that I want to go back to answering the question the way you asked John and Beverly, which is thank you. The grade schools, when we see the grade schools, what do we see? We see high expectations. We see a whole bunch of support. We see great, in some ways, like our friends from McKinsey said before, we see a lot of investment in real professional development, not just, you're a page ahead of everyone else. You see a real investment into teaching. So there's a lot of what maybe people in this audience would think of as the soft things that really make the difference between a school that's high performing and a school that isn't, which is one of the reasons why we have such a hard time figuring out how to replicate. because we think about this as this is the charismatic leader that's creating this. But there's a real science and art to how to not only translate standards into really good, rich curriculum, and then help teachers get their arms around it in a way that they feel really confident about it, not just to teach it, but also to take risks with it, which is what we all try to do in terms of good teaching. So when you see that, when you walk into a school, you can pull a teacher out of a classroom and say, tell us what you're doing. And they will say it as eloquently as Kati just talked about it. And that's the kind of cohesion and the kind of building we have to do. So how do we do it in federal law? There's a bunch of things we have to do. We have to incentivize it. We have to incentivize the collaboration. We have to incentivize the ability to create the supports. Maybe we do, like Kati said, you create this consortium of states to do it. My predecessor, Sandy Feldman, had raised that in 2000 as one thing we could do. Have several states do it. I think some of the governors raised that too. There's lots of things we can do, but it has to be a can-do attitude about how to do capacity building, teacher quality, and collaboration.
So two things. Let me just build on what both my colleagues just said. First of all, there should be no mystery about what is expected at a high level. And so a very clear, explicit curriculum. I was very much taken by what Governor Romer and several on the previous panel talked about, a consortium to develop a set of American standards where youth are able to understand, and parents and teachers, exactly what curriculum brings you to the opportunity to acquire those standards, and what is good enough, and what does that look like. It's why there's never been any real debate about AP, and why there's a great clamor to get into AP. I think that we learned a great lesson from that.
Because there is a set?
Yeah, there's a very clear set of what is the body of knowledge, how you have to demonstrate capacity and competency in that body of knowledge, and how you use that body of knowledge to build new knowledge. And the second thing I would say that Randi made so clear was that in schools that are very high performing, the faculty are continuously learning. And in other professions, when you make the practice public and you have the opportunity to improve that practice, youth learn. They don't learn in a vacuum, and adults are no different. And they need the opportunity to grow in the capacity to teach this level of rigor.
And do you see it primarily as a question of carrots and opportunity, that is providing on-the-job opportunities for teachers to learn and improve and to be mentored? Or is there also a stick? Is there also an issue of people who are not performing and your ability to remove them? Is that a question as well?
Well, it's a huge question. So I'd like to answer it with your first provocation, which is what did we learn? One of the things we learned was that sticks alone are not enough in the first round of NCLB. I certainly hope this country rushes to improve and reauthorize. So that I would say that, but we've learned a great deal about what we can do better in the NCLB 2.0. The notion that a federal government could act as a catalyst around differentiated compensation for differentiated results, the notion of true professional development so that human capacity and human capital systems are improved, are very important. But that has to be a combination of incentives as well as consequences. They're very different from punishments. And I very much think, I come from the belief strongly that when that's done collaboratively, with no removal whatsoever on the equation of rigor, but when done collaboratively between labor and management, because both act as leadership, youth gain in very, very large ways.
Did you want to?
Let me,
and then Beverly.
Let me just say, one of the things we've been thinking about a lot, and those of you who saw the New York Times this weekend, you saw the AFT just started an innovation fund so that we can actually spur on bottom-up or bottom-up school-based labor union reform in this very risk-taking, shared responsibility, entrepreneurial world that we are in right now, that both incubates new ideas but also spreads proven programs. But having said that, that's about shared responsibility, because those of us who've toiled in this field for a while, we understand that one incompetent teacher is one incompetent teacher too many. We understand our responsibilities as a labor union to make sure that there's fairness and due process, and we think that these things can be harmonized. And one of the things we did this summer at the AFT convention didn't get a lot of notice, was that we actually encouraged our locals to look at peer assistance and peer review, particularly at the beginning of people's career before someone gains a due process right, while during their probationary period, because we know that there's been a lot of discussion about, what constitutes tenure, what happens when people get tenure, is it a job for life? We don't think any of that, but our view is this. Let us step up and take some shared responsibility, which we're trying to do, and I think as we do, others will as well. It's a matter of all of us stepping up to ensure that all children can learn to their God-given potential.
Beverly, can I? Go ahead, and then I'm going to ask you something.
I wanted to share that the way in which we approached accountability preceded No Child Left Behind in Atlanta. We decided that we were going to look at progress across the continuum by school, looking at where that particular school was, where they needed to be. Clearly, if they were farther behind, they had to run much faster or they'll never catch up. And we would reward the entire school, faculty, from the principal to the teachers to everyone, to the support staff, if schools made specific targets, moving numbers of kids from the bottom quartile to the middle, from the middle to the top. This has been very much a catalyst, I think, for the embracing of the accountability pieces of the No Child Left Behind Act. The teachers in the schools are so fired up to meet their targets. When they meet it, when everyone gets additional compensation, everyone gets rewarded. So I want to underscore that with penalty, there must also be some rewards as well. And it must be very clear and spelled out, and people must know that indeed they all have something in the game. I think that's the way to go when we talk about paper performance. If you walk into any school in Atlanta, one other thing that No Child Left Behind certainly helped, along with our own accountability systems, people know the data, right down to the last child. They can tell you what's going on. And why they know it, they know what they need to do to meet their rigorous targets so that in the end that entire school gets a compensation. It's not even that much. It's just the notion that they have achieved and they're being recognized. And I think we shouldn't let go of the fact that you could reward everyone in a school, which allows for everyone to have a vested interest in improving their practice, because again, we can't say anymore, it's when you have good teaching in a classroom that you get good learning, and how do we get people to have the skills to deliver instruction.
If I was going to ask you, if I was going to ask you how the accountability provisions of No Child Left Behind, the specific accountability provisions, the measurement, the AYP, the whole thing, how that has affected your ability to pursue the kinds of reforms that you have been undertaking in Atlanta, some of which could not have been politically easy closings. How has this law changed the dynamic, if at all, from what you were doing before?
Well, what we told our people when the No Child Left Behind Act came into existence, continue to focus on teaching well so that you can meet your performance targets. And if you do that, you would indeed make adequate yearly progress. Lo and behold, last year we became one of, I think, if not the only urban system to have 100% of the schools make AYP. But that was not our focus. It was almost incidental too. We wanted you to get the professional development you need. We've gone out, we have tried to find as much support as we can to give our teachers quality professional development, to have the learning communities within the school, the professional learning communities, to get them to understand what it means. Because the truth of the matter, Atlanta will not be able to recruit, given the competition in Georgia for high-quality teachers, all high-quality teachers. It's just a reality. The colleges are not producing enough. The other counties are growing in leaps and bounds. So we've got to figure out how do we get the teachers that we have to improve the quality of their teaching. Some of them clearly are better than others, but as a whole system, how do we get those teachers to teach to high levels? We've got to do it. We've got to find the way. And then we've got to reward them when their students meet the success or the bars that we have set for them.
John, how has the law changed the dynamic, if at all, in your county?
Very much so. Very similar. So we've seen remarkable progress of youth, particularly our youth of color and youth who live in circumstances of poverty. But the law itself, the accountability provision, quite frankly, it just set the table for the work. So our internal performance targets are actually much higher than AYP. We think that's a floor, not the ceiling. And so when we think about this issue, it probably changed the culture in one marked way, and that was one from compliance to one towards performance. And that really has allowed a pay-for-performance model to enter into the county's way of working. It has allowed us to focus on the improvement of teaching and learning, all of the means to get to these ends of kind of the fundamental right of youth to acquire the same level of high proficiency as any other youth.
Katie, you've worked with a lot of local school districts. What kind of tools is the law providing for local superintendents, local principals, and where might it be more effectively targeted to help them make the changes they need?
I mean, I think what we've seen is that what the law has done for reform-minded or change-oriented superintendents, it's put the force of federal law behind their back. It's wind behind their back instead of having to sail into a headwind. I'm not sure, however, that it is felt in quite the same way by non-change-oriented superintendents. And it is very easy when you have two fabulous superintendents like these two, whose districts are making enormous gains, and a very enlightened labor leader. It's easy to think that, you know, we could just kind of move on and we can just collaborate and cooperate our way to greatness. But I think it's pretty clear that unless there's a bottom line to that cooperation and collaboration, unless people have to move the needle, both on student achievement, but also on some of the big issues like who teaches whom, that you're not going to make enough progress. And so while I think the law was clear about objectives and student achievement focus, it's not provided enough hands-on, at least two issues beyond the curriculum one I talked about before. Number one is we still today, as several people on the panels before us have recognized, we still are assigning, on average, our weakest teachers, our least well-educated teachers, to the kids who most need expert teachers. And unfortunately, while the law had some provisions on that, those basically the states walked away from them and the feds let them do that. So we've essentially defined as highly qualified in most states anybody who can fog a mirror. We have to change that, revisit those issues, and have a very clear focus on making sure that our strongest teachers are also teaching the kids who most need them. So that's a place we have to come back to. But there are also deep inequities still in the financing system. Janet talked a little bit about this, but I want to come back to still almost half of the states are continuing to send fewer dollars, state and local dollars, to their highest poverty and highest minority districts than they are to others. So we have still a remaining significant difference in between district revenues. But when those revenues get to the school districts, even in the states that are sending disproportionately great dollars to the highest poverty school districts, because of a variety of things, including teacher contracts, but not only those resources are still spent disproportionately in the least poor schools. And because of flaws in what are called the comparability requirements in current federal law, that doesn't get talked about. So, I mean, and you're talking about very big dollars. We were looking at the data for a Dayton school district just last week. And the difference for a high poverty school is about $450,000 a year less than the school across town in the same school district got. You ask anybody in elementary school, could you do more for the kids you serve if you had $500,000 additional? You bet. But now that's off the table, so we got to come back to that one as well.
Randi?
There's, you know, I can still plead being a local leader, probably. I still have a statute of limitations for a few more months, probably.
Until you learn your way around the metro.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly
Until you learn your
right.
way around the metro, then it's gone.
So, but the what I think has happened here is that whereas No Child Left Behind did shine a light and create a focus, there were good practices and there were not so good practices. So, you know, we also have a huge cottage industry of test prep Inc. going on in lots and lots of places that are trying to test prep their way into meeting standards, and I've never actually seen anyone effectively do that over the long period of time. Particularly, it's part of the reason why you see the scores in schools go like this from, you know, third, fourth, fifth, and then slide down. But you have two superintendents here, and you have other places like Massachusetts and other places who basically said, yes, that's going to help us focus people's attention on it, but we're going to teach to assist kids, not simply test to assist kids. And so I think that the testing becomes a very important measurement and very important to figure out where we are and where we're going. But it's not, in some ways, a means to an end, and that may be where I diverge with some.
And do you, we're going to come back to this, and we're going to turn to one of our moderators for the audience in a moment. But do you believe that schools should be measured by a broader set of criteria than their test results in terms of the consequences of the law?
Look, I do, but I also I want to be very careful in terms of how I say this. When you go into a school that works, virtually all the measures are going to be in the same direction. And you're going to see that. The issue for me in terms of accountability, that's why I go back to responsibility. And in New York, we actually issued a whole different kind of accountability process. And we are, as you see, the chancellor and myself have figured out how to work together to help all kids. But we defined accountability as not simply transparency, but also a blueprint for how to help schools succeed. So, and in fact, one of the main differences between the accountability processes we propose and some that are now currently extant in law is that we also said there should be accountability on the school system to the schools, not just top to bottom, but bottom to top. And so part of this is trying to figure out how do we create a 360-degree accountability system? How do you create that shared responsibility and joint responsibility? Because at the end of the day, there are thousands of decisions that people make every single day in school. And you want everyone who is involved, and it's part of the reason why I'm performance pay, I'm in the same kind of place as Beverly, because it's about a school community. It's about how do you make sure on a school level everybody is in the same place and focused in the same way.
We're going to come back and talk about some of the national issues and how they grow out of these local analyses. But I'd like to see if Jason, are you out there? Jason? He's been talking to people in the audience and maybe has some of the concerns, and we can sort of get some responses from our panel.
Yes, so we've got a couple of questions about professional development, training, that whole sphere of the world, and we had a number of panelists before talk about this. We talk a lot about having great professional development. So the question is essentially, what is good training? Do we know what it is? Who's doing it if we do? And sort of a corollary, do schools of education and all preparation programs, frankly, whether they're traditional or alternative, bear some responsibility for this challenge?
Who wants to start?
Well, I think we certainly know what components of good professional development are. I mean, that's very, very clear. We do know at this point how to teach numeracy, how to teach comprehension, how to teach fluency, and those are just but a few examples. So we know what that is. Good professional development allows faculty to be able to see very clearly what master practices are, to be able to understand the thinking in the teacher's mind as she or he does those master practices in the classroom and has time to go back into their room and do those master practices under the guidance of a mature, accomplished faculty member. That's very strong. It's making your work public. It's making your work public and moving it towards a standard of a master practice and an effective one, and one that are measured by the growth of students, so that when students are learning on our assessments and these conditions are in the classroom, I can acquire that. That's one component of it. What we don't do so well is be respectful of the fact that faculty have to do that and hold down a job, and in many cases, hold down a second job. So we don't do very well on that piece at all, around that piece. So we're actually trying to do it on the short and on the cheap when most other professions actually don't do that. In a simple, large urban school district, if you had 1% of your annual budget on R&D for the profession, I don't know many Fortune 500 companies that would actually exist if that were the case. So the case is for well-used dollars to improve the profession.
I'd like to just jump in on, add to what John just said. I think one of the things we've really discovered is that professional development also needs to be job embedded. By that I mean we need to have coaches, model teacher leaders on the ground in the schools, going into the classrooms after you've gone through all of the training and looking at and learning what it is. There needs to be people on the ground whose only job is to be in those classrooms, giving feedback, demonstrating, meeting with, talking about what's going on, so that it becomes a way of working. It's not going to happen if you just go to seminars or you just have conversations about it. You really need to be to have supports. And we're seeing, and I can reference Atlanta, where we're able to provide those coaches on the ground with the teachers and giving them feedback on an ongoing basis, participating in the professional learning communities, discussing the data, the what's happening with the practice, having them observe one another. I think that is a critical factor. And again, it's a resource issue to be able to do this well, particularly at the middle and high schools as well as at the elementary schools.
I think what happens is this is one of those particular areas where one size does not fit all. And so, and yet we all know certain things that work. And both superintendents have said some of them. From a teacher's perspective, it has to be important. And if it's important, then that means it's going to be part of the regular school day, the regular school year. When you signal that PD is going to happen, at home or at 3:30 after you're exhausted, it gives a signal that it's not important. And for example, one of the things we've tried to do in one of the schools we run, one of the charter schools that the UFT runs, is that we actually have we have a service internship for kids on Wednesday afternoon, and we have professional development in that afternoon for the teachers to embed both concepts in the school day. So it has to be important. Secondly, it has to be job embedded. And third, it has to be somewhat teacher-driven, because if teachers have to be able to say, this is what I need. Fourth, it has to be connected to what you're doing on a day-to-day basis. So time becomes all of our mortal enemies here.
I also think we got to be very honest about the other part of it, which is sometimes less easy to talk about, and that is when we've invested this time and practice doesn't improve, you don't get to stay with us in the organization, and you don't get to be in front of our youth. And so the idea is that we're really clear what good standards are, and we're clear about what good standards of practice are, and the system has a moral obligation to build that. And if that is not built, the system has the moral obligation to say, not here with these youth. And then I also believe the system has the obligation then to rapidly advance those who are improving really quickly as well. So I think that's part of it, and you're going to be real public about that.
You want anything? Okay. All right. Let's, Diane, we're going to go to Diane toward the end with another set of reactions and questions from the audience, but I want to turn now for a few minutes to the national debate and taking some of these local experiences and seeing how you would apply them to the choices we face here in Washington in this presidential race and beyond. So, but I'm going to start as if we were on one of those, little bubble box multiple choice questions for you. So we can elaborate later, but for now, I want you to fill in with your pencil either yes or no. On balance, do you believe that No Child Left Behind, as it is currently written, has been a net positive or negative in terms of reforming and improving the performance of schools around the country?
Positive.
Incomplete.
Positive.
Positive.
So we have 3 positives and 1 incomplete. Yet we are in a situation here in Washington where we are at deadlock in Congress over whether to reauthorize the law. So let's start with the multiple choice question, and then I will allow you to elaborate. Should Congress reauthorize the law fundamentally in the same shape, or largely in the same shape that it is now?
Largely bothers me because I believe there are components of it that need to be changed.
Come back, talk to those right in a moment.
So yes and no. There are things about the law that are absolutely essential. Focusing on kids, focusing on standards, focusing on measuring progress, absolutely essential. But we have to get beyond, we have to get to a point where we build that capacity so that we help all kids. This urgency is not about just having incremental growth. Sorry. In New York, we had standards beforehand. We had incremental growth beforehand. This is now about, if we want this to be the Sputnik moment, it has to be about helping in the next 5, 10 years all kids reach their God-given potential.
Well, I want to come back in a second to ask you.
So correct mistakes made in execution, correct mistakes made in direction of funding, correct mistakes made in metrics used to determine whether or not it's working or not working at a micro level, at a local level, and at a state level, and absolutely reauthorize as quickly as possible. The gap in non-reauthorization is allowing, I believe, folks to take a bad breather. And I'm very worried about that. Maybe accountability is going to hold off for just a little bit. And I think that's a very dangerous thing in an organization such as ours, where we are seeing for the first time real substantial growth for youth who have a long time waited for this to happen, that if we do not continue to press and support on that issue.
Katie?
I essentially agree with John. Same principles, better details.
All right, let's talk about the details. Start with you, Beverly, and then Katie maybe next. Most important changes you would like to see in the law, and where you would like to see continuity in what is done now.
Well, ditto the continuity. I mean, we want those things, those pieces there, the focus, the accountability, et cetera. Changes, the growth model as a measure of success. I mean, we've got to find a way to be able to measure progress for each individual child and each individual class.
And just so the audience is clear, the growth model meaning measuring individual children through their progression.
That's correct,
Right,
as
okay.
opposed to just measuring a fourth grade class versus last year's fourth grade class. We've got to figure out a way to make sure that those data systems exist and the technology to do that. ELL students, I think we have to look at whether or not we should not expect a child who has just arrived and there is no test given in his native language to be tested in English and the system be held accountable. We've got to give them a minimum of 3 years. Special education, special needs kids, we have to come up with another way, I think, of measuring their progress. However, I don't want to lose the limelight and the light that's been shed on their progress. So you walk a very dangerous line, and I think that's what I hear a little bit with what John is saying, that people then think you don't want accountability for those children. Heaven knows we do, but we have to be also, I think, thoughtful in what that accountability measure should look like so that systems don't feel resentful that they're being asked to do that which they cannot possibly ever do. And so those are some of the areas that off the top. I also have not talked about national standards. I have said it publicly many, many times before you heard it this morning. I believe that we ought to have national standards. When I went to Atlanta, I was worried because at that time Georgia was viewed as having very low standards. They have done a good job, I think, increasing the level of their standards, particularly in the area of math, for example, recently. But in order for me to be sure that the children of Atlanta were showing growth, I volunteered to be one of the 11 trial urban districts to take part in the NAEP, because I knew when Atlanta's kids, they're 91% minorities, 76% qualify for free and reduced, and of that majority qualify for free. 36,000 of the 50,000 children in Atlanta live at or below the poverty line. I knew that it would go against most of what was the common belief system if they began to show progress on the Georgia standards. So I went out there and volunteered for the NAEP, the Trial Urban District Assessment, and knew they were digging out of a deep hole. But I did that because I wanted verification that they were actually learning and doing better, which at the end of the day is what we want. So I think national standards needs to be a conversation as we measure state against state, as we begin to really assess if people are showing legitimate progress. You heard earlier about Mississippi and Massachusetts. That, I think, is something that needs to be, and I don't know where and when it will ever happen, whether it's a coalition of volunteer states or something, but movement needs to be made in that direction. And the last part would be the issue of teacher quality that Katie touched on, that what do we mean by a highly qualified teacher?
Katie, can I bring you in and ask you what you think it will take substantively and politically to break the logjam in 2009? Do you see this being reauthorized next year, and what would have to happen to get there?
My best guess at this point is 2010. But what would have to happen to get there is work starts early in 2009. My impression is that staff on the Hill and others are sort of gearing up to do that. They've done a lot of the groundwork already. The Commission and others have given thoughtful recommendations. We've got folks like the Great City Schools standing up around national standards, people actually saying, whoa, maybe we could do that. So I think there's...
What would be the most important ways the law would look different in the lives of people in this room and obviously beyond it to get to that point? What would be the changes that people would feel that you think are going to happen in order to get past the deadlock?
Get past the deadlock?
Yeah, to get it done. How would the law have to be changed, if at all, to get it done in 2010?
Yeah. I mean, I actually am relatively confident that Congress is going to stick with it. I mean, what's happened last year is what happens all the time. I'm not hugely concerned. Yeah, there's been a lot of pushback, but when we spend time on the Hill with both Republican and Democratic staff, while there are a few exceptions, I don't get the impression that there's going to be a turning back of the clock. I mean, there's been pressure on them to do that, but I think they're going to stand up to their responsibilities.
Do you think the law will look much as it does now when it's reauthorized, or will there be significant changes?
You know, it depends on what somebody says doesn't look the same, doesn't look different. I mean, I'll give you an example even in terms of mayoral control in New York City. There's a tremendous consensus about continuing mayoral control in New York City. Now the debate is a tweak, a difference, that fundamentally changes things. I think what happens is that if there is a national consensus on things like, and in the conversations I've had with people in the last few weeks, there's far more of a consensus on what should happen than not. But if there's a consensus on what an accountability system looks like that puts everybody's skin in the game, that's going to break the logjam. If there's a consensus on things like how do you make sure that Mississippi and New York don't have fundamentally different standards, and there's a fairness in terms of the transparency and what that looks like and how the data is used, and then how you help schools actually create a blueprint for success. If there's consensus on that, then I think it moves very quickly. The issue becomes having the conversations so that there's really a national consensus on not just standards and accountability, but how to get it done. Because the reason that school systems around the country are different than this audience is because people feel that all of the work has been shifted onto the shoulders of teachers and principals, as opposed to there being a shared responsibility for the work. Not, as I said at the beginning, not whether this is a crisis. Everyone I know who talks about education or is in education desperately wants all children to succeed. The issue becomes, how does the federal law help us do that?
Do you believe one of the issues, and I want to ask John this, Atlanta seems to be the Lake Wobegon of urban school districts, where we don't have any, we have no one failing to make AYP, I think you said. Last year. And they're all, and they're all above average. One of the questions that has come up around the law is whether it casts too broad a net in describing too many schools as needing improvement, and that is part of both the political and a substantive problem in terms of focusing resources on the schools that are most troubled. What is your feeling about that? Are too many schools kind of falling into the remedial process? Does that need to be narrowed or tiered in some way?
So I want to go back and say two things. The law, several points in the law's reauthorization, which I think are critical, is some of the things that Beverly and others had mentioned, and I think are very relatively easy to do. We need an accountability system that measures growth over time, not in a moment in time. So a fourth grade to a fourth grade, we're in a district like my own where 90% of the kids are different the next fourth grade, big issue. So you need a law that measures growth over time around that piece. You need the law that's going to deal with our language learners. This isn't a language test, it's a comprehension test. We need time for language learners to understand English and then take the test so that we know that they're understanding algebra around that piece. An accountability system that is only focused at the classroom is not enough. We need an accountability system that ranges the entire system. So I actually hope the law broadens to hold central offices accountable, systems accountable for things like providing the professional development and the support and the data and access and parent knowledge. Those are very important issues if we're actually going to believe that the entire system is responsible and it is not just the teacher around that piece. So with that said, do I think that things could happen that could speed that up? The next president has an unbelievable opportunity to act as a convener. On this notion, I'm very struck and very supportive of this notion of convening a group of governors and states to collectively and collaboratively and willfully develop a set of common high-quality American standards, benchmark them against the top 10 PISA countries in terms of rigor. The quid pro quo being a high-quality assessment that could go with that. That goes a long way to allow us actually to do the work of improving teaching and learning rather than having to figure out the landscape simultaneously as well as do those pieces.
John, you raised the P word, the president and the presidential candidates. I'm just wondering, does anybody on the panel feel that do any of you feel that you have a clear sense of how either John McCain or Barack Obama would approach the issues of standards, accountability broadly, and no child left behind specifically? Do any of you have a good feeling for how they might proceed on that?
Well, as I suspect everybody else in this room, have certainly paid very close attention to what each is saying on it. So I think I have a reasonably decent feel for it, but not the details, certainly.
Do you feel like you have a sense of the direction? I mean, Barack Obama gave a speech last week in which he said, among other things, "Don't tell us that the only way to teach a child is to spend most of the year preparing him to fill in a few bubbles on a standardized tests. We need assessments that can improve achievement by including the kinds of research, scientific investigation, and problem solving that our children will need to compete in a 21st century knowledge economy. We'll fix the broken promises of no child left behind." When you hear that, what does that say to you, and maybe Randi next, about, do you have a sense of where he wants to go on the law as a result of that? Or does that give you an indication?
Well, I think he's been quite clear that he's pro-testing and pro-accountability, but wants better tests, more in the game than reading and math. And I doubt there's a single person in this room who disagrees with that.
Mm-hmm. And you think he's committed to the basic accountability structure as it stands?
I don't have any doubts about that.
I think there's no one who's not committed. There's no one I know who's not committed to having a fair, reliable accountability structure. I mean, the conversation right now about growth is that AYP in its static form is not fair and reliable. Sometimes there's an issue about growth models as well. But, that gets into the weeds here. I think what was important about Senator Obama's speech last week was what it summoned a vision of education that was well beyond No Child Left Behind. And maybe I'm just a minority of one here, but I've thought about how the entire conversation about federal education law has now morphed into, are you in favor or not in favor of No Child Left Behind? I think that's wrong. I think that the issue becomes, this has to be, what was federal education law about? It was about helping to ensure, as John Podesta said, how do we ensure opportunity for kids? Now, I'm not saying let's go wide-eyed and bushy-tailed into the universe and start talking about 1,000 flowers blooming again. But I'm talking about how do we summon up that vision again of what we're doing in federal education law. And frankly, I agree with John that we have to do things like something I said in July, community schooling. How do you help, particularly in poor neighborhoods, how do you help bring parents in? How do you help ensure that kids get the health care that they need? How do you do these kind of things? Not everywhere, but in places where you know that schools have to do their part. Teacher quality is the most important factor that a school can give a child. But how do we do more than that? So I thought he was far more ambitious than talking about what fixes you do to No Child Left Behind.
And one thing he did talk about, which you mentioned, was, similar to what you mentioned, was this idea of a what works fund, about replicating what works. And I want to ask the superintendents here, and then we'll turn to Diane. I just want to give her the 2-minute warning here. When you look at what works in an individual school, how easy or difficult is it to replicate it in another place? I mean, can you take successes in one place and move it across town and basically apply that model? You're smiling like the answer is no.
Well, it's been the challenge forever because I was a principal in New York City, and I was a principal at 2 levels there. We had successful schools, and the challenge was how did you replicate what was going on so that you could do it on a scale to have systemic impact. I think one of the things, however, that we have now gotten our hands around absolutely what works and what the research says works. And I think because of that, we're beginning to see more scaling up of lots of successful schools, far more than I think we were seeing early on, because there has been a lot of research done on exactly what you're asking. what makes for an effective school, you know, at the end of the day. And so I believe that we have the answer to that. That's a part of my frustration, is that we keep talking about it when I think we absolutely know now what it takes to make schools effective. Whether or not we come back to the will, which was in the title of this presentation, we have the will to take on all the components of what will make schools effective for all children, is the question on the table. And I don't really think, with all the talk of urgency, that some of those dimensions are being discussed at all.
So I completely agree. We know exactly what works. It's why in the district that I work in, I'm so proud of the fact that you have these dramatic gains in student achievement. It's because we do know what works. The issue for me, and I think for many of us, is not exactly how to replicate that at schoolhouse or classroom to classroom. It's how all of the central systems redesign themselves to be supportive of that. You're talking about rethinking completely HR. You're talking about rethinking the distribution of resources or fiscal. You're talking about policies that actually support a culture where teaching and learning is the most important business in the school, not the adult needs that are way out on the fringes, but actually the needs of the adults who are working side by side with youth. Very important systemic changes that needs to happen. I want to just do the following thing that was provoked by Juan Williams. The title of this presentation is, Do We Have the Will? I believe, fundamentally, we still have deep trains of thought that not every child can achieve at high levels. And until that is actually discussed openly, plainly, and surfaced, the rest of this is going to be an important conversation, but quite frankly, it's going to be a side conversation.
Who's the we in that sentence? We as a society, we as a community, we as parents? Who is the we?
We as a community. A community responsible for youth who do not have agency yet, who are building it. That is the we in this conversation. And, you know, the notion of all of us and all of us in the room, you know, we have privilege. We have agency. It's our obligation to build that in those who don't. And that conversation is right along the fault lines of privilege and poverty and color in this country. And it's a very important conversation, and he could not have nailed it clearer.
Diane, are you here? There she is.
Okay.
See an intervention from the audience?
This is not on, but I think
Yes, it is.
on? Okay, so I think we have a little too much agreement on the panel. We can stipulate now that everybody supports high standards, good teaching, good professional development, reliable but better measures, and accountability. I want to get back to an issue that was raised on the previous panel by Janet from NCLR, and that a number of people in the audience have shared with me as a question that they have, and perhaps we'll kind of draw out some of the differences that may be up there. Earlier this summer, most of you are familiar with the dueling statements on public education, bigger, bolder, schools can't do it all, need to infuse what we do in schools with additional resources for kids like health care, need to address some of the issues of poverty that have an impact on students' ability to learn and teachers' ability to teach. On the other hand, we had this statement by Joel Klein and Reverend Sharpton, both of whom have joined us today, to the effect that we need to and can expect our schools to do a much better job with the resources they have. And I'd like to ask the panelists to kind of comment, because I know at least two of you, one signed one and one signed the other, Kati and Randi, I'm not sure about the others. But in the context of present day fiscal realities, and the present day fiscal reality is that we are literally asking, as the achievement trajectories go up, and in the absence of a dramatic, and I'm saying really dramatic infusion of new resources at the federal level, we are literally asking many of our schools and school districts to do more with less. Many of the projections in my home state of Maryland, the revenue projections are lower than they had been forecasted. Districts around the country are having to think about what kind of budget cuts to make. And if you add to that the need to either incentivize, which usually means more money, right, or attract through bonuses and other means, the better teachers to the schools that are struggling. I think in that respect, we are also talking about additional resources. So can we get a little conversation going
absolutely.
on those
We
money
only got
issues?
a few minutes, so let's get our panelists responding. Start. Do you want to start?
I think, when I came into education, and again, the risk of dating myself, 1970 in New York City, there was an awful lot of resources being placed at the school door to deal with the impact of poverty. We had a lot of good, well-intentioned programs that were coming down for after school and what have you. And what happened, however, was no one was focusing at also the necessity to have good quality instruction and teaching taking place in addition to providing the supports that clearly children in entrenched poverty need. And so we had the pendulum swing very much to where we were focusing and saying, just give us the children, we will teach them, we will not make excuses based on the poverty level, we will get the job done. But those of us who are realists in this thing know that you do need assistance to offset some of those other areas that impact so negatively on students. When you have health issues, HIV rampant in the community, children whose parents need to be, they need to be referred to health services, where you need a lot of assistance with some of the other I think areas that will impact whether or not they can focus and learn at high levels. You have to find a way to do it. In Atlanta, in our signature reform models, we have linked with communities and schools, and we actually have found a way to have them focus on linking our families to external agencies who ought to be dealing with a lot of those other issues, while we take full responsibility for teaching them during the hours when we have them, and because we know that we can do that. We know that, again, there's research that says if a child has a quality teacher for 3 years, their grade levels will increase by 3 grade levels. So it's a kind of a, you don't want the excuse to be because the kids are poor you can't teach them, but you don't want people to be saying just ignore the rest of the impact of poverty and let the schools fix everything. And I think that's where I am personally in this.
We only have a couple minutes remaining. Let's get thoughts from all of our panelists. Quick thoughts.
Look, we have, looking at a couple of people who were in this New York City school system several years ago. We've done a bunch of those things where you have to do both. It's not an either or. We did the Chancellor's District where we tried to do both. We talked a lot in the several panels about how you engage parents, how you do this. It does take a village to raise kids, and if we want to do, John said, we have to. Those of us who believe in helping all kids succeed, we have to be more together than not. Instead of our differences being pronounced, we have to make this urgent, particularly in light of what the economic resources are.
I signed neither because I think it exacerbates the dichotomy of the argument. It's not either, it is both, and it is both when the judgment call is for youth. So I think the idea of trying to say this as opposed to the other, you have to solve the ills of society in order for education to work, or you have to solve education for the ills of society to work, is a false conversation, I think just a bit unproductive. The issue is we have a set of resources, and you distribute those resources where there is the greatest need in knowledge of the best practices. That would be my response to that.
Katie?
Look, nobody who has worked directly with kids, especially poor kids, would ever suggest that we don't need to improve health care and other kinds of services to help kids and families, frankly, that are struggling against very long odds. The reason I signed the statement I did is, for me, the question is not, do I care about those things? Will I work on those things? I always have, I always will. But in the meantime, I think we have got to remain focused on the fact that these kids absolutely can, regardless of family circumstances, they absolutely can achieve at high levels. And our responsibility as educators and in those who are making policy for education is to make sure that they do, to do whatever it takes, no matter what, to get them to the standards we know they can reach. We're just not getting there as a system.
All right, those are going to be our final words. Audience, join me in thanking the panel.
As always. Nice job.
Great job, guys.